Hello and welcome for today's Cyber Talks on how can you secure the modern API ecosystem, to be presented by Mr. Carl Matson. I, Ritika Chakraborty, and my colleague Richa Pawar will be your host for the day. For our attendees, the session will be in listen-only mode and will last for an hour, out of which last 10 to 15 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. If you have any questions during the webinar to the organizers or the panelists, post your questions in the Q&A window. Also, if you face any audio-visual challenges, please check your internet connection or you may log out and log in again. An important announcement for certificate of attendance. Participants need to attend the complete webinar to qualify for the certificate of attendance. Participant should fill in the survey form in the attendees thank you mail and answer the 3 questions based on the webinar, provided with the right answers within the same day. If these 2 criteria are met, then only the participant will receive the certificate of attendance within 5 to 7 working days after the event. Now, about our speaker. Carl is a cybersecurity leader and innovator who serves as the CISO for No Name Security. He has over 25 years of experience leading innovative and diverse team of technology and security professionals in financial services, retail, and the federal government. Previously, Carl served as the CISO for PennyMac Financial Services and City National Bank. He has a track record of providing CEOs, CTOs, and investors in cybersecurity on strategies for product, market, and customer success. Carl has served as adjunct faculty at the University of Minnesota's Technological Leadership Institute since 2013 and previously chaired the Los Angeles Cyber Lab and LA Infragrant Financial Services sector. Now, without any further delay, over to you, Carl.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining, and thank you for the introduction, Hritika. As she mentioned, I've been a CISO for the last several years in the financial services space, recently joining No Name Security, which is an API security company specifically, where I serve essentially as I would call it this in-residence CISO, or the in-residence customer. And so my role is to support API security program development and thought leadership in the space. So what we'd like to really share today are strategies for API security. And for many of you, of course, you have a security background or perhaps a software development background and are very familiar with concepts related to API security that we're going to tackle today. But what I think what we'd like to share today that may be a little bit different, it would be something of a CISO perspective. And so, and this really it comes from my own background, but also the experience that I have with working with organizations about how to design an API security strategy and how to tackle this problem, big picture and smaller picture. Some of the elements of which might be familiar and others which hopefully are new territory. So, so let's begin today. Let's talk about the API landscape overall. So why are we all here today? APIs have been around for a long time, but why is it all of a sudden there is so much emphasis on API security specifically as a category of attack, as a category of protections, and as a discipline? Well, it comes down to volume, first of all. So Akamai statistics from last year, 2019, 83% of global web traffic was initiated through an API call. Google Apogee data from last year shows a 49% increase in API call volume year over year in 2020. So it's sort of a fundamental fact that API is a driver of internet traffic worldwide. And so what are the drivers of that traffic? I think most of us understand that APIs are a centerpiece of our digital life today. They are usually efficient, developer-friendly mechanisms to access data and to interconnect systems. So to give you, an easy example, I think most of us all, might have in our own history. There was a time 10, 15 years ago, you'd log into your banking website to check your bank balance, your savings account, for example. And over the course of time, more data became available when you logged into your banking website. You got your credit score, perhaps the value of your home, perhaps credit card offers and things like that. And those additional features and functionalities are almost always enabled through an API connection. And so when we go back to what is the driver of APIs in terms of their use and their exposure, yes, they're developer friendly, and yes, they interconnect systems, but it's consumer demand, consumer expectations for better experience, mobile experience, web experience, and having more services and data available to them at their fingertips. And I would suggest that there's nothing to indicate that consumers are going to expect less in the future. I think we could expect only more utilization and leverage of API as a vehicle to deliver commercial value for organizations. Of course, when you get into the sort of below the public-facing fold, and you get into infrastructure, now we're talking about workloads like Kubernetes, orchestration, containers, for example, and the use of APIs as machine-to-machine communications internal to a network. We see protocols like gRPC, GraphQL. Those are API protocols, and those are used extensively in modern cloud workloads. It would be common for us to think about the API landscape and to be typically thinking about REST APIs, but there are multiple protocols of APIs, and GraphQL, gRPC, webhooks. Those are just three examples of very commonly used utilities that are only growing in their utilization, and they grow in utilization in step with cloud workload adoption. So we see the trajectory continuing on, particularly with utilization, but now we also have then the threat actor taking notice. In the last year, we see, of course, an extensive series of API security incidents. Those incidents include instances of theft of data and misuse of APIs to pull data, as well as security researchers exposing vulnerabilities and gaps publicly, creating reputational embarrassment, compliance and regulatory implications. And so the companies that I'm sharing here, not to name and shame any particular company, because these are sophisticated companies. They're large companies that have oftentimes invested heavily in API development and API protections. So it is not just the small or the unsophisticated organization that gets targeted for API abuse. It is the largest organizations and those which have sophisticated platforms. As well, we see Gartner research anticipating right about now and through the next year that attacks on APIs will be the most frequent attack vector, frequent in comparison to what we call traditional web application attacks. Threat actors are taking notice because of successes breed more attention, and in a lot of cases, the abuse of an API and the theft of data can happen very quickly because it's a direct line into data. So why is securing APIs so difficult? Why do organizations have, even with sophisticated investment and talent, why are they still exposed? So the example that I'd like to start with is to start to think of yourself as checking into a hotel. And so you walk through the front door of the hotel, and the doors open, and you walk to the front desk and you check in, and the hotel clerk assigns you a room key, and then you use that room key and you go to your door, and that room key authorizes you to access. You're entitled to access that resource now. But like a hotel, there's a number of control points that could go wrong. There could be perhaps the individual checking in could be impersonating an identity. The clerk at the front desk could assign the wrong room, or the system of record that manages access to the hotel may have an error in it in sort of its design. because we have to consider factors like common access doors, access to the pool, access to the soda machine, and access to the room itself. So there's multiple control factors at play with API security. And so what I would suggest is that when we look at API security, the difficulty is not that each step along the way is itself an unknown quantity, but there's always context involved, and those layers of controls have to work together. And for APIs, they work together in a sort of a different context and a different sequence than they do with traditional web application security. Traditional web app security has some correlated factors with API security, but not all. And so we'll talk about some of those differences overall. So first and foremost, APIs are always moving. Just as guests check in and check out of a hotel, APIs are everywhere. Defending APIs is accomplished across multiple control layers. And then last, the API defense requires business context. It's essential to protect an API is to understand what is the API exactly designed to do in order to protect it. So it isn't just about the list of bad threat actors, it's also about what is the expected good behavior that we anticipate. So where we fall short is that web application controls have some effectiveness, but not total effectiveness on the API landscape. It's only partially effective. API inventories change, come and go every single day. Organizations oftentimes have 100% or more APIs in production than they believe they do because of the diversity and the degree of change happening in the organization. Single choke points of protection, web application firewalls, API gateways are not always. APIs and API gateways and WAFs can be fantastically effective when they're used. Rogue legacy APIs commonly are not behind the layers of protection. API inventories are rarely close to complete. East-west API calls, we call inner APIs or internal network APIs, are rarely run through a gateway. Legacy and dormant APIs are active. And of course, ultimately, threats exposing like authentication flaws, these are business logic attacks, are rarely discovered until after a breach has occurred. So what are the strategies we can employ to defend our API estate without stifling innovation? Because if you go back to the example of the banking application, of the banking website, where new data, new features, new customizations are going to be a mandate for business commercial progress. How do we adopt a posture without stifling that sort of business prerogative? So in order to do that, let's understand a little bit about API security incidents and understanding context in order to derive some of the strategies. So those of you, of course, who have an application security background, you're going to find this very simplistic, and there are amazing courses on EC Council that can do more justice to the specifics of attack types. But I just want to characterize these sort of thematically and how API security incidents work. So let's start with the OWASP API Security Top 10. A fantastic place to start to looking at the universe of API security risks. And first note, Gartner estimates that 60% of all API incidents are OWASP API 1 and OWASP API 2. Authorization and authentication are by far and away the most common problems that we see. And most of the time, the problem in authentication and authorization is a disconnect between the developer's intent or the design of the API and the way that the API is sort of enforced or run through policy management. So an API management gateway, for example. So an example of this would be that there's a form of authentication employed in the design of the API, which is not the same as the policy implemented in the gateway. So that's exactly the type of exposure of configuration that is very common in the API security incidents, is the misconfiguration in a disconnect between the layers of control. So as we go through this API security top 10, what I wanted to sort of emphasize here is not to go into these in granular detail, but just to pick out a couple of them, just to show types. There are types of API risks which are inherent in the design of the source code. There are also inherent problems in the configuration. Rate limiting is a great example. Rate limiting is usually enforced or applied by an API gateway or perhaps a web application firewall. So when we do source code reviews, we do DAST and SAS scanning, we do penetration testing. Like rate limiting would be the kind of thing that we typically don't test well, because in production, when the rate limiting policy is applied, that's where the configuration problem or the rate limiting exposure may be. So when we go down further to any type of security misconfiguration, some of those misconfigurations definitely happen at a network layer or in the header layer. It may be related to asset management. It may be related to insufficient logging and monitoring. Logging and monitoring of APIs is a little tricky because one also has to consider the business context, not only just the raw sort of event log itself, but whether and how we identify anomalies is not as specific as whether a threat attempt was made by a known threat actor. It's really about whether there's an exposure of business logic that can be derived from the logging and monitoring. So once again, I'm kind of going back to this concept of API security is a layered defensive strategy. We usually think about API security historically as a source code issue, and it is exactly that, and it is also a network configuration issue, it's a gateway configuration issue, and it's a process and procedure issue for the security teams who are monitoring and looking for anomalies. So just to give a quick example, I'm using an example of Venmo because the Venmo incident, it really isn't an incident and it's very public. So all this information is publicly available. But in this case, a security researcher disclosed that they were able to pull hundreds of millions of records of customer payment information from Venmo. If you're familiar with Venmo, I use it, I love it. There is a social aspect of Venmo where I can see my neighbor's transaction when they perhaps order pizza. That's the design of Venmo, is to share that information. This researcher scraped that data to the tune of hundreds of millions of records in a short period of time. So there's multiple things to consider in this incident. Number one is the API was designed not to be authenticated. It's designed so that I can see my neighbor's transaction to purchase pizza. That's its design. To fix that, one would make a source code change, likely to establish an authentication practice for that API call. The second piece, though, is the rate limiting, which is one researcher, one person pulling hundreds of millions of records when the intent, of course, is to be sort of a social media feed for my friends and family. That this researcher showed that they could download basically everything across the board. And then the third area is on the vulnerability remediation. This is a security researcher who attempted to notify the organization, and the organization had no response. And so think about this as like a bug bounty program where procedurally it's important to be able to intake and interface with the sources of vulnerability information. And then the last is the privacy policy itself. There could be healthy debate about whether or not this particular configuration of feed was advisable. And the point on the Venmo incident, though, is just to illustrate that the incident itself had reputational and regulatory damage to Venmo, and it would not have been solved with source code alone. It would have been solved with a combination of developer source code change with API gateway rate limiting based on rational use. It would have been considerably lesser of an incident had they had the practice in place of remediating the vulnerabilities quickly, and then also the rational discussion about the privacy as to whether that was a good idea in the first place. So layers of control apply in virtually every API security incident. There is no one single point of failure. So let's go on to the new strategies. A couple of things that I'd like to sort of start with is how do we tackle this problem of API security in such a way that's specific to APIs, but also is familiar. It's not a whole new practice of security. It's really an adoption of things that we probably already know how to do. So first, let's start with program. And as a CISO perspective, I know that software developers and engineers may be bored to death of a maturity model, but this is actually fairly simple, and I think it's a very practical way to go about thinking through API security. So and a security maturity model, so many of us are familiar with CMMI, we're familiar with OWASP, BSIM, some fantastic models out there. For API security, there really isn't an exact model that fits for API security, but there's a model that we can change very slightly to make it really well suited for our use, to create for us a category of maturity that we can self-evaluate and then target a future state. So the model that I recommend highly is called OWASP SAM. It's the Software Assurance Maturity Model. This is a general application security maturity model has broad industry adoption. It's open source, it's freely available. I highly recommend that folks consider using OWASP SAM in looking at your application security programs. With APIs, if we look at the SAM model, what we've done is we've taken the SAM model and done some sort of minor adjustments to it, because most of the concepts apply as a program design with some minor modifications. And so maintaining the structure of an industry model, and for anybody interested, going through this exercise, for me was about a day's worth of focused time to take the OWASP SAM model and sort of mold it into a model that is really useful for an API security program. And so certainly this is an exercise that I know a lot of people are well qualified to do as a sort of a self-exercise. This is something that we do for our customer base. This is sort of the standard offering is to provide this model along with then detailed guidance as to how to apply the model specifically, all of which is inspired by the OWASP SAM model. There's nothing proprietary about this at all. But I would suggest folks take a look at the SAM model in thinking about API security. So let's talk about that model for a second. The model is, think of it as a 91 question questionnaire. And those 91 questions fall into categories: metrics, policy, education, things like developer training on API security, or defect management, our ability to detect during the build process an API vulnerability and move that back into the software development's queue to treat as a bug or a defect for security reasons. And then the self-assessment level is essentially, do you do it sometimes, most of the time, all the time, sort of a self-assessment questionnaire. And so let's look at the questionnaire real quick, because as a couple examples here, I think will help illustrate this in a way that makes this it's a very user-friendly model. So let's just go to like one section here. The third column, this requirements testing, this would be the 91 questions. So do you test APIs using randomization or fuzzing techniques? Is it yes, not at all, yes some of the time, yes most of the time, yes all the time? So that's a question that internal to an organization, usually that answer can be derived fairly quickly, because we're only looking for like a high level statement of where we are. The next step, the next sort of set of columns then is, depending on whatever the answer is in current state, then we can devise timelines or phases that we aspire to move to additional states of completeness, additional states of maturity. So no, we don't do testing of APIs randomization or fuzzing today, but we expect to begin to do it next quarter. And by the end of the year, we expect that we will have all of our API estate covered with that style of testing regime. Wonderful. We now have made sort of a decision or a choice on the strategic development of where you're going from a program perspective. The metrics themselves, is it 2.63 or is it 2.75? What I would not suggest agonizing over what the number is, so much as what I think is worth agonizing over is the decision process that you go through as part of an assessment as to what you prioritize as a team, what you prioritize as a company, and a set established goals in the future for where that program, where you're going to invest in training, invest in technology, invest in new skills and staff to reach a destination that's acceptable for your organization. The outputs of the model look like a maturity model, probably that many of us have used before, a spider diagram or a chart. But as a storytelling device, this can be very, very useful. Number one, to facilitate a thought process, facilitate a thought process in thinking through the strategy and the approach that you take for a program development. But then also to create the why and the rationale for, let's say, requesting new staff, because we need to request new staff who can focus on training, or we need to invest in a new training program for our developers because it's part of a strategic plan that we have for our API program development. And so as I go back to the sort of the why here, is that this is a self-assessment that any organization perform to diagnose where your program's at for API security or software assurance overall. If you want to use the standard OWASP model, it's a fantastic model. And then from that the value is in the conversations about where you're going to develop in your program over the course of time. So this is a model that I spend a lot of time with, and of course, in the format we have today, we don't have an enormous amount of time to really dive into the details. But what I sort of wish to offer is consider me an ally as an AppSec program and looking at APIs specifically or AppSec generally. Myself and my team, this is what we do. We coach and we advise. And so whether it's content or advice, these are my inspiration is certainly OWASP, but that by no means can we not continue discussion with your organization about how to apply that concept for you. So that's a program side, and as a CISO, this is a context that for API security that I value tremendously in thinking through where is it a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now that we need to have in terms of program development for API security. Little quick side note, of course, is every organization will need to develop some degree of detail in terms of the roadmap, performing the assessment, establishing baselines of vulnerabilities and configurations or gaps in the program, establishing the foundation policies and processes. So taking the first steps to configure, maybe it's configure tooling, maybe it's develop new developer training, moving into operationalization, scaling across an organization, and optimization. And this is sort of obvious that there's an implementation plan of a project, but what I would suggest is that a key or a critical success factor in developing the API security program is going to be the active participation of the API development teams and product owners, because these are assets that they have a sort of business ownership of. And so their participation in the process of developing the roadmap is critical. This is not a function that security teams are largely going to be successful in. If they're endeavoring to take on an API security trajectory, that's counter to the wisdom or the intent of the software developers who are developing these APIs. So let's take a brief snapshot then of the tools. So we talked a little bit about the program. Let's get a little bit into tooling. So what are the objectives of the tool? And so I suggest, first of all, there's 3 styles of technologies, or three functions of technologies in the context of API security. The first of which is posture management. Posture management is sort of a broad term, but it starts with an inventory. It's know thyself. Whether it's SANS or CIS critical controls, what's critical control number 1? Inventory. What's critical control number 2? Inventory. The same is true with APIs. We have to have full east-west, north-south coverage of an inventory in order for us to have like a running start at securing the ecosystem. Next then is from that inventory, deriving from it misconfigurations and vulnerabilities. So a great example would be I have an inventory of APIs, which is public facing, and that inventory of APIs that's public facing does not match the inventory of APIs which are brokered through a web application firewall. Okay, we have a misconfiguration on our hands because we have an API that should be brokered by a gateway or web application firewall, or it needs to have its public facing features turned off. It is very common in sort of from our vantage point to see APIs in the environment which are not intended to be public facing, which are connected for internal use and are used for that, but are also exposed publicly sort of accidentally. That is a configuration flaw that can be fixed very quickly. So posture, think of hygiene, right? That's the services of asset inventory, configuration control, vulnerability management. Like we do for every endpoint, we have those factors of hygiene that we apply. The second would be then the concept of detection and response. So think of this as EDR for APIs. EDR for APIs essentially is assessing or identifying runtime anomalies. When a misuse or an abuse or an anomaly is in progress, the ability to identify it and then intercede with that activity while it's occurring. So either an automated or semi-automated routines for blocking and remediation. So there's hygiene of the environment of APIs. There's the runtime anomaly detection and response activity. And then there's the third thing, of which of course, which is the inherent quality and security of the source code itself. Continuous testing of APIs during the development process, static code analysis, dynamic code analysis, pre-production pen testing, and to the extent possible is automating that testing in such a way that the capitalize on automation for APIs. What APIs do have an advantage of with all three of these activities is that the API software asset itself is typically a relatively small unit of source code. Think about the endpoint of an operating system. Even a user operating system is a complex computing asset that has hygiene, EDR, security features to it. It is not trivial to secure an endpoint with an operating system. An API endpoint has fewer moving parts. There are fewer variables at play. And so I think the advantage we have in API security is you look at these three categories, API security is a more solvable problem because the variables are fewer, except for one, which is business context, which we always have to consider in all cases. So let's go through these. Integrations are key to do this from any vantage point. It is essential, of course. Telemetry from your API gateway and your WAF, of course, is sort of obvious because those are the control layers that typically are protecting APIs today. But it is imperative then to also have a reference point and a source of information about activity that starts at this network layer. So it's whether it's the public cloud traffic mirroring, whether it's connected to a load balancer or a Gigamon or A10 or devices like that. Because if we're talking about misconfigurations, it is so common that the misconfiguration exists only in the context of how that asset is deployed in the network. And so it's imperative then to have a network context as well as the context of the protection layers themselves. Then going back to incident response and integration with SIM SOC tools to alert and notify on anomalies and deviations, as well as then integration back with the developer teams. So the suggestion here, of course, is that the tool sets, regardless of what tools you end up selecting, these are the 4 integration points that are required really for the security team to have a complete coverage of that hygiene, of the endpoint detection and response, and of then the source code itself. So APIs do have an advantage. I think we can do this all from sort of one vantage point, but these are the 4 layers of integration of the tools themselves. So the other thing about single tenant, you can run an API engine on-prem, you can run it as a single tenant SaaS. In my experience in using API security tools, it's important to select technologies that conform to the contours of your network and the contours of your deployment, rather than expecting the contours of the network to conform to a tool. So when you think about tool selection, definitely think about your on-premise and SaaS options. And the more offerings that meet your architecture style, your templates, that's going to be a better fit. So on-premise or SaaS, I think that's a strong consideration for how we engage this activity. So posture management, just to go real briefly here, what does it look like when it's done? It looks like very basic inventory. It's how many APIs do I have? What's the inventory in its totality? What are the characteristics of those APIs? Like how do they authenticate? How many are public facing? How many go through a gateway? Classification of data. How many of those APIs are trafficking in sensitive data types? And can I search and tag and filter according to third-party vendor, according to application name or product name, like the mobile app as an application name? And when the security team has, think of this as sort of like a litmus test question for the quality of an inventory. If you were asked by anybody, the CEO or the CIO comes to you as a security practitioner and says, hey, dear security team, how many of our APIs today are sending out credit card data? If you have a precise answer to that, it's 7, it's 4, it's 27, whatever the number is, and know that you have an accurate depiction, that's a good inventory. And so that sensitive data piece is really important, because ultimately what we're trying to do with API security is, amongst other things, but kind of top of the list, is to prevent the theft of sensitive data. So we have to have a complete understanding of where that sensitive data is going, and precision is really important in the inventory. The second thing is sort of to divide up the inventory. We have organizations, I've seen organizations with north of 50,000 APIs. And so now dividing up that into business units or application names or geographies is of course important, like you would in a CMDB for any organization. The next is that vulnerability and misconfiguration check. So as I mentioned, the OWASP top 10 for APIs is not exclusive to source code quality. It is also configuration, and it is also observable from a network layer. So to have a composite view that covers all of the API top 10, one has to have a number of data sources that can correlate and layer to identify vulnerabilities, particularly of configuration. DLP for APIs. So as I mentioned, an inventory includes the classification and the type of data being sent. Developing policies then that illustrate to the security team where sensitive data is going so that you can wrap policy around it. DLP is a 4-letter word in some areas, like I get that. DLP is super touchy on email, it's touchy on a lot of different vehicles. With APIs, we're talking about structured data calls. DLP with APIs is actually pretty straightforward. And so that is a tool at your disposal as a security team. That's a huge advantage to seeing sensitive data moving with DLP policies applied to the APIs. EDR for APIs. This is where APIs are funny. So I can take it to an example here because API anomalies are very commonly described as like business logic attacks, and absolutely that's true. So let me give you a perfect example of like a sort of business logic violation that would be characterized as it's a BOLA attack, a broken object level authentication. So in this example of an API, we have the request, and think of this as Mr. Benjamin Olivia, fictional name, of course, checking their bank balance at their bank website. So we have the JOT token, the bearer of the token is the first item, Benjamin Olivia as a username, as a plain language username, and then the user ID itself. And then in the response, the username and the user ID always match. And so what we have in this circumstance is we have a business logic rule. We have an expectation that this API will behave in this exact way every time. And it requires for us to see this business logic flow, we have to have a deep inspection of the traffic itself. We can't just see the peripherals, we have to actually see the payload. But now we know is that the expected response is a model, and this model applies to this API call as designed. So this is the business intended use of the API. In the next example, the request from that user, that bearer of a JOT token, the user ID and the username do not match the responded data. And so what we have here is we have a circumstance where a requester with a valid JOT token with a legitimate user ID, but the response, the retrieval was somebody else's bank account, someone else's healthcare record, and that mismatch now can be modeled as a behavior that can be detected as an anomaly. This is not a detection that is possible by identifying, for example, like a list of bad actors. A list of bad actors does not provide any sort of defense on a business logic attack. It's only on the internal of the API itself and learning the intended use and the intended business context that we can identify a sophisticated attack like a broken object level authentication. This is a case where an authorized user has gained access to someone else's record. And so once an attacker is successful at doing this one time with one record, then they know that they can repeat that pattern because that vulnerability is present. Where there is a mismatch, there's an allowed mismatch between the identity and the authorization of the user request, which is not related to the data that's then presented back to the user in response. It's really important, I think, to sort of emphasize that business logic aspect, so that every API is sort of in and of itself an endpoint that has its own. Every endpoint is a snowflake, and that every snowflake has its own expectation for what good behavior is. And this is an example of one where a web application firewall, for example, would not pick up this as a threat activity probably. And an API gateway may be exactly the place where a configuration change can be made to enforce a policy or a source code change that could make this problem go away. But it isn't in the gateway that one will find this vulnerability, but it could be the gateway where the vulnerability then is fixed. So, and then in that sequence, of course, we want to go through the prevention routines of, do I block the user? Do I block the IP address? Do I block the user ID? And having options at your disposal, depending on the type of anomaly. One may need policy to block at WAF. One may need to push policy to restrict user at gateway, or of course policy then to push an emergency change to a developer team. The important thing is that from anomaly detection, you have workflow options at your disposal. A good example of this would be for your average EDR endpoint of CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, et cetera. When we have a threat detected on a Windows operating system, there are options at your disposal. You could disconnect TCP session, you could restrict user, you could send a technician to go pick up the laptop and turn it off. There's options at your disposal. The important piece, of course, is that you have the data about the misuse in progress, and then you have the tools of integration to then affect change or affect the remediation accordingly. And then the last thing is then testing in the pipeline. So go back to your developers and the development pipeline for APIs and apply static and dynamic testing thoroughly through the course of development. And my suggestion is to consider that the developers' use of the DAST and SAST technologies is probably more important than the selection of the technology itself. So in my experience, when developers have expressed a strong preference for one tool over another, because they have a lot of difficulty using this DAST tool. It's difficult to use, it's tough to integrate with, it disrupts my workflow as a developer. I really want to use this tool instead because it's built right into my development toolkit. It's a native part of my workflow. Like that's the tool to pick. And yes, of course, there are statistical differences of like DAST and SAST technologies in comparison to the types of vulnerabilities. But I would strongly recommend to not overlook the aspect of it being developer friendly. So the clean integration with source code repos, CI/CD pipelines, and then the workflow for taking a finding and putting that finding back into the developer's backlog. I think a best case scenario is that a software development team who's developing APIs receives an insight on a vulnerability from a testing platform, and that insight is treated like a bug defect, and that bug defect goes into a backlog. It's prioritized by severity, and they're fixing security vulnerabilities just like they'd fix a performance vulnerability, or just like they would fix a functional defect. And so I think that's the maybe pie in the sky in a lot of ways, but I think that's what we as security teams need to keep considering, is how do we make the developer's life easy at adopting a security recommendation or a security finding that's coming from our scanning technologies or our code review activities in such a way that they can make rapid use of that and incorporating it into their build processes. So in short, that wraps up my the core presentation. I would love to spend the balance of the time fielding questions from everybody who's joined today. And again, I realize that we cover a lot of territory pretty briefly in terms of the security maturity model, program development, and then as well as like I call it the 3 pillars of technical design. So posture management, EDR, and secure code testing, all of which I've covered at a very superficial level. Let's take questions, but that's my contact information. This is what I talk about all day. I'd love to connect if we don't have time today. So.
Thank you, Carl, for such an informative and interesting session. And that was a very interesting webinar, and I hope it was worth your time. Very important announcement. This session is in sync with the EC Council WHS CH program. EC Council's Web Application Hacking and Security is a specialization certification that enables you to learn, hack, test, and secure web application from existing and emerging security threats in the industry verticals. It's 100% hands-on and challenge-based learning where you get to learn by doing. There is no death by PowerPoint. You can follow the instruction as they make their way through these challenges. If you are a penetration tester, security analyst,
Uh, we have lost her maybe because of the technical issue. So if we uh, the CEH, what we have, it's a complete digital course where you have everything, videos, labs, exam is one package. Get certified as a web application security associate, professional or an expert. EC Council's CEH maps to many ethical hacking roles in the industry like security analyst, information security analyst, certified ethical hacker, security consultant, site administrator, and network management executive. Anyone with CEH certification is eligible for 1,80,000 plus number of immediate job openings with an average salary of 9 lakh to 11 lakh dollar per annum. If you are interested to know more, kindly take part in the poll that's going to be conducted now. Let us know your preferred mode of training and we will reach out to you. So now we will start our Q&A session. Pitama,
Yes, thank you so much, Ritika. So we will start with the Q&A section, Q&A session now. Hi, Carl.
Hello.
Hello. Okay, so we'll start with the Q&A. So, Carl, the first question that we have, the question is from an audience member whose name is Govind Vagle, and he said that he just wants to ask that in the talks, having an API helps us develop multi-platform applications, which is great for sure. But he has seen many people only see the positive aspect of it, but we do not realize the dependencies it carries. So, what is the best and recommended approach to maintain the availability of the API for each platform that makes the request without having to add additional resources?
So I do apologize. I might be a little bit of a hard time hearing. And so if you I'll
Hello?
do my best but if you could maybe type the question in the chat window, then I can make sure I get that right.
Yeah,
But I think I think it's important when we look at API security to look at the inline technologies that we utilize for protection are web application firewall, API gateway, and whatever sort of IDP we're using for authentication. And I would not add to that. What I would suggest that we can do with API security is we can do posture management, hygiene, we can do EDR out of band. And so that's what our company strongly advocates, that we should not be adding any inline proxies. We should not be adding any more touch points because availability challenges. So as a security professional, I know that you're all have at some point in your experience had an angry user. And let's say it's a user who's locked out of an application, or a user who's locked out of their desktop, those types of things. Security always walks a fine line of trying not to disrupt business operations. In API security, that is 100-fold, because when you're dealing with APIs, you're commonly talking about a organization's revenue channel. And when an API becomes unavailable for use, you're actually cutting off generation of revenue in a very direct way. So it is not advisable for the security team to employ anything in line other than, I would suggest, a web application firewall for public facing, as well as utilizing a gateway, and a gateway built and a WAF configured for high availability. So 100% agree that but I do think in API security, there are ample tools at our disposal that that are available out of band, so that we should not be adding more inline proxy at all.
Thank you so much, Carl. So, Carl, the next question is from Alice Lawrence, and she's asking, what machine learning approach do you advise to be used? Is it mandatory for the organizations to that the organizations should follow devs? Okay, sorry. Okay, so the question from Alice Lawrence is, what machine learning approach do you advise to be used for API?
Sure. So there's maybe two ways to look at the like the I call it threat scenarios. Number one would be in the course of development of any sort of critical API that's public facing and has sensitive data. It is absolutely best practice to perform threat modeling, to consider any possible permutation of activity or misuse that could happen, so that during the development process, threat modeling would be the way to go. Now, when we get to machine learning, what we have the benefit of doing is in observing that API in production, and observing its pattern of behavior over time to develop a statistical confidence in how that API is intended to be utilized. So like here's a perfect example of like an ML model for API. We have all shopped on Amazon.com, and when you shop on Amazon.com, there's a particular sequence of things that has to happen. I have to log in. I have to find an object or find a thing to buy. I'm going to buy a new keyboard, and I add it to my cart, and then I go to checkout, and I might change my credit card, or I might change my address to make sure it arrives, paying with the right account, and then I check out. A sequence violation would be the type of thing that only a machine learning algorithm could detect, and that sequence violation would be something like, I have a user who did not log in and who did not add to cart, and who simply submitted a request to change address with no other sequence being adhered to. Because what we have in sort of a sequence pattern is it's like the perfect machine learning problem, which is to establish a pattern of expected good behavior, and so that we can kick out or at least alert on those activities and API calls that we see that deviate from the specific pattern. And so every API itself needs its own model. And that's what we do. We do an ML model for every single API. I showed the illustration of the API inventory, 529 APIs. That's 529 machine learning models that have been developed with a sample size usually of 20, 30, 50 calls that establish what the good pattern is, so that we can then identify what the bad behavior pattern is. And so I think that sequence violation is a good example of where an ML pattern comes into play, and it really only comes into play well, at least like to a degree of quality, in production, because that's when you see the statistically valid sample size on which a machine learning model can establish a baseline and then continue to learn with that API as it changes over time.
Thank you so much, Carl. Carl, the next question is from Ronnie, and his question is that, is it mandatory for that the organizations should follow DevSecOps guidelines for the development, testing, and deployment of API? How security guidelines changes from REST API to GraphQL and WebSocket API?
I think the first question is entirely organizational. I guess I could be characterized as an advocate for like a DevSecOps approach, but to be perfectly frank, I think the security team is in the position of strength in influencing the organization when the security team's model matches the model of the development teams. And so if you're still in a waterfall development shop, and yes, there still are a lot of them, there's still a lot of even teams within big groups that have a different methodology. It's imperative that the security team adjusts its engagement model accordingly. So a good example would be for so many organizations, you have like Salesforce team. And a Salesforce development team may be a large team. They handle a ton of sensitive data. And oftentimes, like a Salesforce team doesn't follow the standard playbook for its development practice. Salesforce is just a different animal. And because Salesforce is a different animal, we're not commonly going to be successful if we expect the Salesforce team to adopt the security guidelines. What it is, it's imperative for the security team to adopt the delivery model of that team. And so that's why I would just suggest that it's organizationally specific as to the model you employ. Just employ the same model as the developers. Meet them on their territory, and you take away 80% of the reasons for friction and for miscommunication. And can you repeat the second question, please? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. The second question is how security guideline changes from REST API to GraphQL and WebSocket API.
I actually think that they shouldn't change. You have a different like a spec. Your documentation will be different. You may have a different standard for expectation of standards, like what requires authentication and et cetera. But no, I don't think that they're qualitatively the same. And what we be challenged by, of course, as an organization is we may be developing GraphQL APIs, but have not considered them in scope for like the application security program. And so the real challenge of GraphQL, webhooks, or gRPC is not that a different standard applies. It's like technical standard. We should have the same expectations of the outcomes. But what we often have is we have like citizen developers or infrastructure developers who move forward, not even knowing that GraphQL is something that needs to be reviewed or it's in scope. So I don't think that there's a technical difference. I think the difference is in everyone's collective understanding that yes, these are in fact APIs, and yes, in fact, there are expectations for a rigor around development and deployment and configuration. It's really a scope challenge to make sure that everybody knows that they're in scope.
Thank you so much, Carl. Carl, the next question is from Godwin, and he's asking how secured is Telegram? My developers time they would integrate it with a software to handle my project that concerns supply chain management through blockchain.
I think I only heard part of that. Is that one that you could drop into the chat window? I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I get that right. I think I missed a couple keywords, sorry.
Yes, sure, I'm just writing it in the chat window. Yes, it's the second question.
Oh, yeah. So I have no opinion that I expressed publicly. I don't know the Telegram API. The context around the practices or I'd say the perspectives that I've shared today is around APIs that your organization's custom develop. The perspective around the commercial APIs that you adopt, Salesforce APIs, Okta APIs, a Telegram, Slack, for example. I do think that's kind of a different universe of how we assess third-party APIs for our consumption of theirs. So to make a long story short, I don't have any intimate knowledge of the Telegram API to suggest I have an opinion. But I would suggest that there's a companion presentation of what we talked about today. I'm just talking about what we develop ourselves as IT organizations. What we adopt from our third parties, that's another tangent there. It's an important question. I wish we had, and maybe that's an idea for a second session to talk about securing the third party APIs that we consume.
Thank you so much, Carl. Carl, the next question is from Kevin, and he's asking from an information systems auditor, what would you say is the best approach to test the control around the security of an API?
I would probably go back. I'd probably suggest going back to the API security maturity model. Like go back to OSAPS, Sam. yes, it's 91 questions, and as a former subject of audits a lot, I don't suggest a 91 question audit. But what I would suggest is inside those controls of 91, there are key controls, and so those key controls would be things like pre-production testing, pre-production change control, in-production inventory management, lifecycle ownership, playbook response for vulnerability identification, playbook incident response for SOC operations, those types of things. And so I think that what I would suggest is start with the SAM model as inspiration, and perhaps based on context or your own wisdom, whittle that down to the key controls that are probably in the neighborhood of a dozen that would be very testable as an auditor. Then I'd be asking for the evidence for the organization to demonstrate that they have met the objective, the control objective for those maturity targets. Now, maturity targets is, it would necessarily need some smoothing, because there's a continuum when you're talking about maturity, and auditors aren't looking for a continuum, they're looking for hard results. So, but I would, if I was designing an audit plan for my own team, I would start with that as the inspiration, and that's how I would whittle it down to roughly the 10 key controls. And I'd try to incorporate a couple of controls in build, a couple in run, and a couple in like IR vulnerability management.
Thank you so much, Carl. So that was the last question for the session, and with this, we are wrapping up today's Cyber Talk with Mr. Carl Mattson. Again, Carl, thank you so much for taking the time out for giving such an informative and such an enlightening session to us. I'm sure our audiences have learned a lot from today's session. To our audiences who have taken part in the poll, our representatives will get in touch with you. And with this, guys, we are ending the session today. Thank you, Carl. You all may disconnect the line now.
Thank you. Have a great day.